Greetings and salutations, Afrolites. It is I, Afromandius, back with another video today. And actually, this video is going to be a really special one and also kind of a sad one. Not like sad in the sense that, like, it's like a good kind of sad, if that makes any sense. But today, we're actually going to be focusing on the last character that ever has a major slash minor role during the Great War Saga. I know, it's been a long time coming. We've had our fair share of characters that have been represented in both the Chronicle and the Great War Saga and the Legend and the Great War Saga. And I know what you guys are saying. It's like, Afro, there's so many characters that were focused on in the Chronicle universe that was in the Great War Saga. What the heck? What's going on? How come you're giving more representation to Chronicle than you are Legend? And I say, hush. It's not necessarily in the sense of I'm giving more representation more to the other, but it actually kind of makes it a little more special because in a sense of when it comes to writing and storytelling, that's what makes Legend and Chronicle so different. Because if I have a lot more cast and crew that was focused in the Great War Saga, one, it would get kind of repetitive because I would say the same talking points about bringing up Cinderella Man and how his effects are during the Great War Saga and how the characters were before the Great War Saga and how they are afterwards and whatnot. So, with all that being said, it's more or less that's what makes the legend characters in this universe so special is one, we kind of see where they are already. And the fact that we already see them kind of settle down and allow themselves to kind of be more established and have their own like morals and duties and whatnot, rather than see them grow up. Because not to say that their childhoods weren't important, but we kind of see them how they are now, and especially when it comes down to the effects of the Great War, we see these characters see basically their whole lives crumble around them and see like their families and friends die before their eyes. Not to say that Chronicle didn't have that either, but I think that's what makes it more special compared to how Chronicle is because we don't have a lot of characters that are in the Great War Saga that is focused, heavily on. But basically, with all that being said, I am really excited because now for the most part, I'm kind of done talking about the Great War Saga and the characters that kind of make it up. I may go back to it. I may actually, start a new series. I know, stemming from creating a champion, building a bastard, I'm now actually going to be working on a new series called Kins and Conflict. Kin, Kins, and conflict, yes. So basically what this, video series may be about, and again, I'm going to be talking about my champion in a little bit, but I just want to make an announcement that, focusing on this series will be like, basically the relationships between the main character and like their parental figure and whatnot, right? So basically, as I mentioned before, during the Great War, we had the old generation, as I mentioned in my last video, that being King Yami, King Adam, King Set, and General Raijin. Basically that's a video focusing on what the main character's relationship was like with their parents, but it will be focused more on the perspective of the actual parent themselves. So as I mentioned before, when it comes down to this certain like aspect of focusing on the characters in the Great War Saga, they weren't like, obviously I have like King Yami as like an antagonistic force, and he does play a role as an antagonist during the Great War Saga, but his roles were so minor and he died pretty early on during the Great War Saga that he doesn't leave that much of an impact on the rest of the story. But his son does, later on when he becomes a main villain and main antagonistic force, right? So when it comes down to Kins and Conflict, it basically focuses on the actual parent during the Great War Saga. And I don't know when I'm going to get started on this. I kind of want to move past the Great War Saga for right now. I don't know when I'm going to come back to it, but that, with all that being said, that's just basically a new series idea that I came up with is called Kins and Conflict. I don't know who I'll get started on first. It'll be toss of the coin flip, or roll of the dice, whatever. But with all that being said, long intro aside, let's talk about our final legend character for today. And I've already mentioned him back in my Kova Dragon video. Basically, he makes a minor appearance in there, basically kind of helping out Kova like during the Great War and whatnot, and allying him his fight against against Yami during the Rising Renegade Saga. And that character today is Clay Roc'Wel. All right, give a round of applause to Clay Roc'Wel, everybody. Woohoo! Clay Roc'Wel. All right, so, who is he? What is he? I don't need to explain because I've already have explained it back in my last two videos. He is a rock elemental, and he actually has an interesting case about him because when it comes down to this sort of thing, we are going to actually focus on his past a little bit because it's a little more interesting compared to the other two. Obviously, when it comes, or the other three, I guess you could say, because I had King Yami and Yami Omoboros and Kova and whatnot. But anywho, let's talk about before he was born, right? So, before Clay was born, obviously when it comes down to the elementals and whatnot, they had their own territories and stuff like that. And as I mentioned back in my King Yami video, basically talking about the hierarchies of the elementals and whatnot, right? So as I mentioned before, Yami and King Yami and Yami Omoboros are technically considered apex elementals because, what are you going to do against like shadows and darkness and whatnot? You can't really do much against it. But there's also a bunch of other apex elementals. As I mentioned back in my Yami Omoboros video, I talked about Ivera, who was a predator and beast elemental. And I've also mentioned the lightning elementals, or like Bolt and his father Cabal. Those are lightning elementals. Those are also considered apex elementals. But there's also a super rare, not in danger, but super rare elemental that can exist, known as a light elemental. Now, obviously, with a light elemental, they are basically beings of light. They are shown to be the most powerful and most dangerous elemental. Not in the sense that they are like malicious or anything, but let's just hope when you meet or come across one, they're having a good day, right? So basically, when it came down to that sort of thing, as I mentioned back in my last video, when there's like darkness elementals, there has to be something to balance that out, that being the light elementals. So there was obviously a great, a great war between those two. It's not called the Great War, but it's basically a fight between the darkness elementals and the light elementals. Don't have a name for that yet. But, when it came down to that sort of thing, the light elementals recruited all like the nature-based and, more like life essence elementals, if that makes sense. So like water elementals, earth elementals, grass, or trees and whatnot, and then you look at the darkness elementals and they recruited more destructive and more dangerous elementals. So that being fire, that being like more dangerous, like, I guess you can say lightning elementals were added in there, and that kind of adds the fray of like Cabal and whatnot. Cabal, his people, their like powers and abilities are considered destructive, but they weren't like malicious individuals. They weren't like, they wanted to be by themselves. They wanted to live amongst the clouds with the cloud elementals, and the cloud elementals didn't want any part of it either. They just wanted to be in sky and do their own thing. So obviously that led to like the conflicts between him and Cabal, which led down to, the conflicts between Yami and Bolt, blah, blah, blah. Basically, there was a great war, and this kind of wiped out a lot of elementals, but the darkness elementals did come out on top and thus made King Yami the leader. And of course, eons pass and whatnot. And as I mentioned in my last video, the elementals don't really like age the same way as we do. We don't really, their bodies physically age, but their soul gems do not. But as their bodies physically age, it kind of not rots away, but kind of disintegrates itself into the soil of the earth, blah, blah, blah. Their soul gems kind of collect into this giant amalgamation mass that is in the center of their like planet and whatnot. So Afro, what does this have to do with Clay? Basically, when it comes down to the rock elementals, they have been knocked down severely. They are considered to be one of the weakest elementals, in their like society and whatnot. Not to say that they're weak in power, but they are very much, when it comes down to like fire and like winds and darkness, they aren't the first choice when you want to try to pick an element as a superpower, right? So this kind of unfortunately led down to the path where all the males fought into this great elemental war, and kind of left the females to themselves. Not to say that the females can't fight, but obviously when it comes down to the elemental culture, family always comes first, and with the male hierarchy, of the family, the males basically left to fight in the war, and the children were stayed with the wives and whatnot, right? So this kind of led down to a population decrease because for some reason, before like the Great Elemental War happened, the female rock elementals were just giving birth to like girls and whatnot. So it was harder to reproduce because obviously, a lot of weirdness and whatnot and questioning and blah, blah, blah. Basically, when it came down to it, when all the males basically passed on fighting in the Great War, it was just left but nothing but females. So over time, obviously the females can't really like the females kind of like grow and they mature and whatnot, but they don't have any male mates to kind of start a family with and whatnot. So their population is kind of decreasing. Not to say that they're dying or anything, but it kind of takes a long time for them to die, and they want to kind of spread their territory. They're kind of getting surrounded by a bunch of other elementals, and they want to spread their own territory and influence and whatnot, right? So one of these rock elementals decides to take action into her own hands. She's, girl bosses herself up, and basically she basically just kind of tears into the planet themselves. Not like hurting the planet or anything, but she uses her abilities to kind of like dig a hole down to the center of the actual planet itself. And, she like begs and pleads to the soul gem that makes up the planet itself to grant them some form of like resolve to allow their like people to go on. And with the soul gem seeing just how much perseverance and determination that this female rock elemental had, basically shot a light at her. And as of course the Bible, there was a virgin birth, the virgin birth, that being of Jesus Christ. Clay Roc'Wel was basically constructed. So in a sense, it kind of, when the light was passed on to her, it gave her an insatiable hunger. This insatiable hunger made her eat rocks. Don't question why. She wanted to eat so much rocks. Now, this doesn't like the result of like her eating her own people, but basically it just kind of ate around the surrounding areas, and her people were like, what are you doing? Stop. We need this for our homes and whatnot. She's like, I'm just so hungry. But as time goes on, she becomes pregnant. So obviously with the rocks that she was eating and whatnot, that kind of developed and formed into an actual like male rock elemental inside of her. So that male rock elemental became Clay Roc'Wel. So of course, with him being born, everyone was like, oh, joyous day, we're saved. And so obviously, like, with the village of the rock elemental women raising this man, it's kind of weird in a sense, because that they were saved, but also it's kind of messed up because they kind of used him to kind of help. He basically became a brood father, if that makes any sense. You know what a brood mother is. He kind of basically was used to kind of help repopulate the rock masses, if that makes any sense. So obviously over time, there became more rock males to kind of help with the rock population and whatnot. So, with him being at the top of the food chain and him having this harem, it kind of gets knocked down a little less when you see another rock stud come in and they're like, ooh, I want that one, and blah, blah, blah. Anywho, so his purpose has been fulfilled, and this kind of makes him depressed because, he kind of was at the top of the world. He can access any kind of women he wanted to. He was kind of seen as a commodity. It was like this novelty that is like, oh my God, I just slept with the only male rock and, blah, blah, blah. So, it wasn't just him, but also, it wasn't just like the rock people, but also other like females from the, different territories came to see him because he was the only rock male. But as more like males are born, that kind of makes him feel less valuable and whatnot. So he kind of goes off and does his own thing. So obviously with him, with the elemental culture and whatnot, they're seen as like, the family is the most important thing. But as Clay Roc'Wel grew up, he never really got to have that family experience. Like, sure, he had his mother, but he never really had a father. He never had brothers. He was kind of seen as just this like one-way ticket to like become like being brought back and whatnot. So this kind of puts him in a depressed state, and this kind of makes him upset. But then, say it with me, everyone, the Great War happens. Oh, God, Lord have mercy. I can't wait to see all the compilations of me saying, then the Great War happens, then Cinderella Man appeared. I can't wait. Who knows? I may make that my own thing. I may download all my videos and just kind of splice all the times I say, then the Great War happened. But basically, yes, the Great War happened, and as I mentioned back in my Kova Dragon video, basically focusing, Kova was kind of, he was an able-bodied male. He had to be taken away from his family. He left his family behind. But when it came down to Roc'Wel, he didn't really have a family. He kind of had women who he, did the kissing with, and they had kids. But, he was so distance away from them that it wasn't really hard for him to kind of just say, all right, I guess I'm part of this war now. But in a weird, selfish kind of way, he realized that with this war happening, he realized that if he's able to make it back alive and all these other rock males kind of die or pass on, he can become a commodity again. And so this is kind of adding to his flaws and whatnot, and just kind of makes him more of a selfish, hoo-ha and whatnot. So obviously the Great War happens, and as I mentioned before, Cinderella Man comes around and he just, dog walks Yami. They're like people tear him apart, but Clay Rockwell's not a part of this. He is doing off and trying to find Kova. And as I mentioned before in Kova's video, him and Kova kind of get along because they're kind of seen as, their tribes are kind of seen as rivals, because obviously with them being rock based elements, sand and rock, it's very much like a rivalry between the two, because one is considered more brutish while the other one's considered more weak and less durable. So the sand people have a name for the rocks, and they call them the solidifiers, while the Solodites. I don't know why I said solidifiers, but basically the sand elementals called the rock elementals solidites, while the rocks called the sands the pulverized or the pelletized and whatnot. So, it was basically kind of like, a dog whistle being thrown at one another. And, it was all in good fun. It was like, they didn't hate each other. They just, they find it so funny that in a technical sense, they both throw rocks in a way, and they are made up of rocks. It's just one's bigger rocks and one's tinier rocks, right? So, anywho, him and Kova kind of become good friends during the Great War, because Kova was depressed and he wanted to go back home to his family. But, obviously with Clay, he didn't really share that same sentiment. He just wanted to go back so he could get his harem again. But he did kind of help Kova in realizing that if we can get this war done and over with, we can go back home to our families. And so, he kind of pumped him up and allowed him to realize that there is a resolve, there's something at the end of this. But, after realizing that this great war caused the creation of the Cinderella Man, they were like, yeah, no, we do not want any more part of this. In fact, we are going to rip you apart because you basically sent us to our doom. But at this point, as I mentioned, Kova, doesn't want anything to do with Yami. He already hated Yami. So he was just like, all right, I'll leave him behind because there's already a bunch of people going after him. I want to go back to my family. The planet's dying and whatnot. And if he wants to at least try to gather his family to go on a ship to kind of leave it, he would want to at least die with his family, right? But as I mentioned before in Kova's video, his family sadly does not make it, and this kind of makes him depressed. And Clay finds him, and he's like, come on, dude, we got to go. The planet is dying. And he's like, no, I refuse. Kova refuses to stay. He says he wants to die with his family. And this is the part where his Clay's more flawed side comes out. He's like, it's fine, you could just make another one. And this sends Kova over the edge. And obviously they both have different views about what family is. So, two sides of the same coin and whatnot. Family, one doesn't really see the importance of, the other one had a family and they saw him die. So this kind of sends Kova over the edge, and both of them have a big brawl that leads up into one of the ships and whatnot, and that blasts off, and lands on Earth. Blah, 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 the Rising Renegade saga happens. Kova does his own thing. Clay Roc'Wel also does his own thing. He's not part of Shadow Light like Kova is and whatnot, but he kind of goes off and does his own thing. Now, as I mentioned before, in Yami's, or Yami / King Yami, basically the Yami family video, I had mentioned before that Yami Umaboros becomes the Admiral of Earth, and he runs this thing called the Black Parade. The Black Parade basically is the altruistic authoritative militaristic force that makes up this entire planet, and he basically controls everything. What he says goes. And again, I'm still kind of writing out how the power system is, but basically with him being at the top of the chain, he obviously has these things called commanders. Obviously are sectored in different parts of the world. And Kova was actually a commander, but he was a double spy for both Shadowflight and the Black Parade, and whatnot. But then Clay Roc'Wel was also part of this ranks, but he was more of a captain. So basically it goes like this: World Admiral, Commander, Captain. Who was Clay Roc'Wel taking orders from? And that was the Dawn of Steel. The Dawn of Steel is a character that I've created, which is basically an AI system created by Dr. Samuel Rodriguez Green Day, and it becomes a rogue AI and wants to prove that it's smarter than Dr. Samuel Green Day. I'm not really going to go in depth about its history and whatnot, but just know that it's a robot that wants to prove that it's superior to mankind or to Dr. Green Day. But basically it becomes a mob boss in a weird way. It becomes like a head like tyrant and becomes like a antagonistic force against the Rising Renegades. So they cross paths, and in a weird sense, when it's all said and done, I'm still kind of writing it out, but basically there's a side story where Clay and Bolt actually kind of team up to kind of take on Dawn. I'm still kind of writing it out, but basically that's kind of the role that he serves as, more of a mentor figure for Bolt. And obviously with Bolt, being a young, spry elemental, he's a lot more chaotic and whatnot, and Clay kind of keeps him in line. But this kind of helps like play in his favor of becoming more of a like parental figure, and allows him to realize that family and whatnot is more important than anything else, blah, blah, blah. Still kind of writing it out. But, as I mentioned before, okay, let's go all the way back when they did land on Earth. So Kova kind of leaves like for Clay to die, because he's like, screw this, screw you, how dare you desecrate the family name of like the Dragons and whatnot, and how dare you misinterpret that, like family comes above anything else, blah, blah, blah. He leaves him to die. But, Clay, before he not dies, but he's kind of left there to rot. He's actually saved by a couple of witches, and those witches kind of take him in and allow him to heal and kind of gather himself. And obviously, this kind of plays a role in the the Rising Renegade saga. Basically, these witches are present in the sense of Selma and Salem. So Mother Salem and Mother Selma, those are the sisters that are present in the Rising Renegade story. Mother Salem is the like adoptive mother of Bolt, Blaze, and Bonk. So her role is that she's actually the love interest of Clay. So Clay, of course, with him being not raised, but being healed by the witches, he learns about their culture, and they go into hiding, and they teach him all this sort of different stuff, and he grows attached to them. Obviously, he grows attached to Mother Salem. I don't know why that's. I keep thinking Mother Selma, Mother Salem. Mother Selma is Kova's love interest. Blah blah blah. So basically, with all that being said, is that he kind of grows attached to her, but he realizes that he can't stay because this isn't really his home. So he begs and pleads to take Mother Salem with him. But of course, with her, she realizes that kind of a weird reflection, but it's like, I can't leave my family. And, with Clay not having an understanding about what family is like, why are you just going to stay with them? You'll do the same thing with these different, with the same people every day for the rest of your life. And she's like, I know, but they are my people. They are my family. So, obviously they kind of go their separate ways, and then blah, blah, blah. Clay Roc'Wel becomes like basically like a what would you say? Not a mercenary, but basically becomes like an enforcing officer. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the commanders and whatnot in the Black Parade. So then, as I mentioned before, he teams up with Bolt, because I'm still kind of writing out what happened, but basically, he hates Dawn of Steel, so him and Bolt are going to try to take him down. But for the most part, that's kind of it. Obviously, later on, he realizes the error of his ways, and he does grow attached to Bolt and sees him as like a son, or it's like a surrogate son. Like, obviously, he's very much hesitant because he doesn't want to grow attached to any of these people, because he saw, like, as I mentioned before, he doesn't view family the same way that Kova does, but he was still kind of heartbroken knowing that the families that he did make, he never really got attached to, and he kind of was this just wandering lonesome being throughout the, like, planet. And he was kind of seen as more of a commodity than an actual individual. So he's saddened. And the worst part is that now that his planet is gone, so is his family. So then, his family could be off somewhere. They could be dead on the planet, but he doesn't know. He doesn't wish to know, and he doesn't want to think about it because it makes him sad, because he realizes that at the end of the day, like, he wasn't really a father, but he was more like, he wasn't a father or a son. He was a tool. And so, that's how he views himself, as no more than a tool. So that's why he kind of force himself to be a part of the Black Parade, because what else has he got living for himself, right? He doesn't have a family to go home to. He doesn't have a, like, significant other he's fighting for. He's kind of alone. But after being a part of the Rising Renegades and seeing the bravery of Bolt and the rest of the gang and whatnot, and him coming back in contact with Mother Salem, he realizes that there is more to life than just being alone. And he was never really alone. He just chose to isolate himself because that was the easiest thing to do. So, obviously later on, him and Kova kind of rekindle their friendship and realize that, they need to step up to protect the new generation of the elementals. Obviously Bolt and Blaze, but also the Rising Renegades, because they see them, they're, at the end of the day, with them, how old they are still kids. So, when they go through a traumatic event that's caused by Yami and whatnot, I'm not going to say it here. I think I may have said it in another previous video, but basically there's a traumatic event that happens that causes them to kind of, like, be more closed off and lose hope and whatnot. So they were like, you know what? Let's just take the fight to Yami. And they kind of step up their game and realize that, sure, they're weak elementals, but there's 2 against 1. They have that sort of odd against them. And they're able to hold off their own against Yami. But with Yami having access to a star shard, he kind of steps himself up and becomes more an evolved version of a darkness elemental. And he's able to basically put them down, not like kill them, but like, put them in their place, blah, blah, blah. Then Bolt comes back with his own star shard gifted to him by the Shadow Flight. Bolt beats Yami, day is saved for the most part. And so, this kind of allows Clay Roc'Wel to realize his actions and wants to be better. So that's kind of the story that I have for Clay Roc'Wel right now. Again, it was a little bit shorter, but I like how short it is, and I like how simple it is. And again, I'm still kind of writing things out, and he does play a role in the, in the Great War and also the Rising Renegades, and whatnot. So, that's kind of what I have for him so far. What is his powers and abilities? As I mentioned before, with him being an elemental, he can transform, he can make body modifications, he can transform his body into different weapons and whatnot. But there's actually an interesting thing about Clay, is because in a weird sense, with everything else I mentioned about, like, elementals and whatnot, he is a unique case because he doesn't really, like, he is made of rock, right? So he's a lot more durable, but it's a lot harder for him to kind of regenerate and allow him to, like, be rebuilt and whatnot, right? Not to say that's impossible, but it takes a lot more time. So, as I mentioned before, when it came down to actually, like, understanding the hierarchy of the elementals and whatnot, Rock was kind of placed as, like, the weakest, because, when you knock off an arm of a rock elemental, it's not going to, like, dissolve itself back into a new arm like sand or fire and whatnot. It needs to gradually regrow itself, and that could take time. So, either that, or, like, he could just grab some, like, rock from the ground and that's what makes it grow faster. But he needs his surroundings, he needs to be surrounded by rock in order to do so. So that's kind of what makes it a little more difficult for him to, like, fight in combat. But this also kind of makes him more, like, privy to like fighting and whatnot, because he has to be a lot more careful. So with him, you know, he doesn't really have like, he can't really like form like how Kova and like Yami and whatnot, they can form like, you know, how am I trying to say this? Basically, like he can like use the elements against them as like external force. He can't really, Roc'Wel can't really do that, because, you know, he's not gonna like, he can basically, at most what he can do is just like earthbend, right? So that's the closest that he can do. So he has earthbending and whatnot. He can grab rocks and turn it into his own like little weapons and whatnot, and he can like form rock gauntlets, or he can form himself into like more of a solid material, like turn his skin into a complete stone. So, you know, it's a lot more different, but it also kind of falls into the same ballpark of other elementals. But that's kind of, oh, excuse me, sorry, I had a big breakfast. But that's kind of his powers and abilities. Where does this character morally stand? So again, as I mentioned before, with him being a champion and whatnot, he's not really an evil guy, but he very much is an individual who would rather kind of just be by himself. And honestly, that's real. Like in, you know, society and whatnot, a lot more people are a lot more to themselves. Not to say that there's no like extroverts out there, but when it comes to him, he grew up in a sense of he was seen as more of a tool than an actual individual. So, you know, he never really got that experience of like social interaction, because all the like males and whatnot were kids, his kids for the most part, right? So it's just, it was more weird than anything else. But as he grew more like accustomed to what's happening on Earth and him being attached to Salem and the Rising Renegades, this kind of helped, you know, kind of develop more feelings and allow himself to understand like he's more than what he was thought of for himself, right? So that's kind of where he stands and whatnot. So, you know, what does this character mean to me? This character is weird because he's in a sense of, when I started creating him, he was basically just a Kova knockoff, like a Wish version of Kova. But as I thought about him and as I kind of just reeled back and tried to add more layers and details to him, he became his own being. And that's one of the best things when it comes to writing, is that, you know, especially if it's something that I've already seen before or something that I can like take inspiration from. Kova is such a unique character because at least his dynamics when it came to Clay is that they are two opposites of each other. You know, they are very much like, one sees family as the most important thing in the universe, while another sees family as just kind of you know. And when it came down to that sort of thing, Kova still kind of had that family aspect to him because he was the commander of Rhythm and Blues, and Rhythm and Blues obviously were younger than him, so he kind of saw them as like, you know, students and whatnot, and he appreciated them really much because they were good at their jobs. You know, obviously with them being double agents of Shadowflight 2. So, you know, when it came down to that sort of thing, Clay is a really interesting case because it's a matter of basically how every single one of my characters are, is that they're trying to find their identity and trying to find their place in the world. And I think that's one of the most important things about us humans, is that, you know, at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, I think we're trying to find understanding and trying to find our place in the universe. And as I mentioned before, you know, I'm not going to dwell on this, but, you know, I'm not going to like trauma dump or anything. But when it came down to me, I always like asked myself, like, what is my place in this universe? Who am I? What am I trying to be? You know, of course, throughout the years, there have been many different answers, but I realized that I don't really need to live up to anyone's expectations other than my own, you know. And I've realized that, and it took me a while to understand that, but I was just so muddled down and trying to understand, like, why can't I, you know, why don't I have a lot of friends? Why don't I have a lot of social interaction? And that's because I'm not being myself. You know, in college, I'm allowed, you know, I can be myself. But, you know, as I mentioned before, that's kind of what, you know, it's all said and done. And if you like watch these videos and whatnot, you see that most of my champions are trying to find their place and trying to find their identity and try to understand who they are as individuals. of course, with everything that's happened to them, they kind of lost a lot. They lost their family, they lost their home, they lost their culture, but they realized that this is a new beginning for themselves. This is a chance to redeem and put more like goodness and goodwill back into what their races were. And I think one of my favorite things of all time that I don't know where I heard this from, and I wish I did because it's honestly one of the most profound things I've ever heard, is that when it comes down to you and how your life is and where you are, it is only a chapter of that life. And whether it's good or bad, how whatever is happening to you, it is coming to an end of a chapter. And that new chapter is being written. You know, it's a book of life, basically. And, you know, regardless of what impact you have, both good or bad, you know, there's going to be people who are going to judge it, you know, and whatnot. And it's just, I wish I knew where this was from, but basically it was an individual who was seen as like a monster and, you know, has done terrible things, but wants to be better and wants to improve himself. And, you know, basically he's told by the other individual that, you know, your story is still being written. And, you know, no matter what you do and no matter how you see yourself, you know, if you want to do better, if you want to improve yourself, you are willing to do it. And it's up to the masses to decide whether you were good or bad. And so that's kind of the idea that I want to get across with my characters, is that, you know, regardless of how you see them, their stories are still being written. And of course, when there comes to a story, there comes to a beginning and there comes to an end. And I feel like this is kind of poetic in a sense, because I feel like we're now at the end of us explain, or at least me explaining, what these characters are and what their foundation is and how they began and how their roles in these stories are. So it's kind of melancholic in a way, because I'm happy, but I'm also kind of sad because, you know, I'm going to have to push the Great War Saga away for a little bit. You know, now that we're kind of done with the foundation, you guys understand for the most part what's going on in the Great War. This is now my chance to kind of explore the bigger worlds that are focused on, you know, the Chronicle Earth and the Legend Earth. I don't know which one I'm going to get started on first. It'll probably be determined by a coin flip, you know, or who knows, may come across to me in a dream. But with all that being said, I truly want to say thank you all so much for joining me on this journey. I know that my upload consistency can be a little weird, and I know that the videos that I make can be, you know, not to say boring, but it can be very like monotonous, but and like tiring, and, you know, like get to the point already. But I just want to say, for those who have stuck around and for those who are watching these videos, thank you. All I have to say is thank you. It's been such an amazing time doing these kind of videos and just kind of talking to the camera and allowing myself to express my worlds and my stories to all of you. You know, and obviously with that being said, you know, I'm happy. I'm happy with how everything is turning out. Sure, we're still small, but I would rather it be small, because it allows myself to kind of figure out what I need to do to improve and be better. And, you know, for those, you know, again, who are watching but not commenting, you know, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to bite you. I'm here to say that this stuff is going to take off. And, you know, before I end this video today, I just want to give the biggest and most wholehearted shout out to my #1 fan, my father. My dad, you know, although he doesn't want to say that he, you know, like, regardless of how he says things, he says, like, regardless of if he was attached to this project or not, you know, I was going to do my own thing. But honestly, I feel like with him and his encouragement is what allowed me to kind of push myself forward to do these videos. So with all that being said, all I want to say is thank you, Dad. Thank you for always being there for me and always kind of listening to my ramblings and whatnot. I know it may not make a lot of sense to you, but with us and having our Sunday conversations and us like watching my videos and whatnot, you are allowing me to kind of explain myself and whatnot. So with all that being said, I am truly, truly happy to how everything is turning out. And we have reached a milestone because now we're on case 10. We're on double digits now. So, let's continue with this drive. Let's allow ourselves to kind of, take ourselves a little bit of time to understand what's happening and, focus on the task that's at hand. And, we'll see where we go from here, right? Again, I don't know which one I'm going to get started on first. Who knows? Maybe I'll focus on what's going on at DAD. I know that I haven't really talked about DAD, but it's kind of its own little universe. It's the sisters. It's like the, redheaded stepchild of the family. Not to say that I don't love it or anything, but who knows? Maybe my next video will just kind of be focusing on like the different creatures that make up my universe. I don't know yet. I'm still kind of working on that. But with all that being said, Afrolites, I have been Afromandius. Thank you all so much for watching. And I'll see y'all next week. Stay frosty and stay fresh, Afrolites. Love y'all.